In this presentation, we'll take a look at the introduction to the Middle Ages, briefly talk about the medieval concept of Christianity, and also of the prominence of hell in their artwork. It's interesting to look at the trajectory of art and how it really took a different turn in the Middle Ages. If you look at from left to right, we started out with the archaic Greek chorus, quite stiff in the Egyptian pose. Then in the classical Greek era, we see the S-curve and contrapposto and an idealized natural beauty. And then when we look at the Nike of Samothrace, we see the Hellenistic expressive sculpture. Then when we look at the lower right corner, we see a medieval frieze, and you can see that the observation of nature, the expressive power of the Hellenistic era, these things, instead of becoming more pronounced, have been, in a way, eliminated. So it's interesting to look at the culture that would have created such a different form of art. The very earliest Christian art is difficult to identify. At first, Christians were persecuted. Their main converts to early Christianity were lower class with very little resources to create art. It was actually only as Christianity was sanctioned by the state, particularly by Emperor Constantine in the Edict of Milan in 313, where Christianity was legalized, and as the upper class started to convert to Christianity, then the church became universal, and we start to see what we think of as early Christian art. The Middle Ages are generally classified as running from 500 to around 1450. The late Middle Ages, or the Gothic period, or the high medieval period would be 1200 to 1400. With the fall of Rome, the idea of an international state with sophisticated infrastructure and the thorough Roman system of law was gone, and society was organized on a much smaller scale. The system was feudalism, and the scale was quite small, limited to a lord's own lands. The basic hierarchy was that the king was the most powerful person, a lord owned land, and vassals were bound to that lord to protect the land. Serfs were bound also to work the land. And there was very little mobility within this system. For the peasant class, or the serfs of the medieval system, they were the most numerous class by far, but they had very, very little power of any kind. They were mostly illiterate, mostly working jobs of hard labor and farming, with very little chance of changing their lot in life. The nobility would have inherited land and titles and might have had the leisure and wealth to patronize the arts. So in this era, there are constant attacks on a relatively small scale. And you see this is reflected in the artwork to some extent, in that there are very precious Book of Hours that are engraved for a wealthy man or woman. There are small ivory pieces. There are decorated sword handles and pins to put on a person's clothing, but the art tended to be on a small, portable scale, just as the rest of society. Another important force in the medieval times was the clergy. It itself was a hierarchy. A bishop has much more power, had much more power than a priest, and of course the Pope was the head of the entire Western Church. It was divided between priests and monastics. The monasticism was a very important element of medieval culture. if it were not for monks and nuns of the period, we might not have some of the classical texts that they preserved. The Middle Ages got their name from the Renaissance historians who came after them and felt that nothing of interest had happened between the great Greek classical era and their own, the Renaissance. And this slide is just meant to point out that though it is true that the Roman Empire had fallen and that there were many, many small-scale challenges and attacks, there certainly was an active intellectual and theological life for those who were living during the Middle Ages. Outside of Europe, the Islamic Caliphate was growing and thriving. Baghdad was considered the center of learning for the world. And in Islam, religion and science are not opposed. So they were used in tandem to make some great discoveries and scholastic traditions. Also, the Islamic Caliphate was responsible for some advanced mathematical thinking and the preservation of classical Greek texts. In medieval Christianity, the Catholic Church was universal. Nowadays we have a lot of denominations, but that did not really even begin until the Reformation. There was, of course, the great divide between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, but beyond that, the Catholic Church in Western Europe was universal. Theology emphasized punishment and redemption. So in many, many versions of Christianity at this time, this life on earth is really just sort of, people called it a veil of tears that precedes the greater life, the eternal life afterwards. And that life could, what we do in this life could lead to going to heaven or to hell. Hell was a very real place for medieval Christians, and a great deal of artwork is devoted to showing the day of judgment and what would happen if your actions sent you there. In terms of continuity and transformation, we can look at an example such as Dante, who's writing and creating artwork about the Inferno. When we talk about the circles of hell, even today, it's a very common expression, and that comes directly from Dante. It's important to take a minute to discuss what the Mass is. The Mass is the symbolic reenactment of Christ's Last Supper. It would have been sung using Latin chant. As the church calendar progresses, some parts of the service change, but some stay the same every week. These 5 parts remain the same, so any Mass will include a Kyrie, a Gloria, a Credo, a Sanctus, and an Agnus Dei. The Mass forms the basis for musical development for the several hundred years of the medieval period, where the church really was the greatest patron of the arts. The church year is an annual cycle of feasts, so the changeable parts of the Mass would reflect what feast was being celebrated. So, for example, Easter and Christmas are feast days. There's also the All Saints' Day and other feast days. The office is the daily cycle of services that would have been celebrated certainly every day by monks and nuns who would really spend most of their day singing and in prayer. And you can see Vespers is probably the most well-known service, which is an evening service. Some features of Christianity at this time include the worship of saints. So you could at this time pray directly to a saint who would intercede with you with God on your behalf. So there were patron saints for various activities. There were the patron saint of travelers, the patron saint of musicians, and that kind of thing. And you would pray to your patron saint. Another feature of medieval worship was the worship of relics. So a relic would be a piece of the body of a saint or a holy object that was sacred. This picture is the Shrine of the Magi in the Cologne Cathedral, and it is one of the most famous relics in all of Europe. People would make pilgrimages to come see these relics. And the related word is the reliquary, and that is the place where a relic is kept. So this is an example from 1190. Here is an arm. Over the centuries, people would travel to see and touch the relics of this saint. And by about 1500, the last of the bones, an arm bone, was in danger of disintegrating, so there'd be nothing left. So this reliquary was made in the shape of an arm. Here's another example, the reliquary of Saint Foy from 950. One other element of the Christian faith that was so important at this time was the idea of pilgrimage. So many holy people and ordinary people who were seeking to do something for their faith would make a pilgrimage. And there were books printed that would help guide them from one place where they could stay and where they could see a relic or worship, and help them lead them from one to another. Now, this Santiago de Compostela was one of the most famous destinations for pilgrimage. And this is just a link to a book of hours. So this would have a book of prayers for Catherine of Cleves. The site that is indicated here has a lot of information about each page. It's really interesting to hear about the symbolism and the meanings behind each page. There are hidden meanings within her own family, reflecting some of the tension with her husband, and there's also just a wonderful variety of backgrounds and elaborate borders. So I think you would enjoy looking at this Book of Hours of Catherine of Cleves.